Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for your participation in today's webinar. This is Mónica Arenas from Futures Without Violence, and we are hosting this webinar on supporting the mental health of survivors of human trafficking. This webinar is part of Futures Without Violence project called Building Collaborative Responses to Traffic Victims of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And we thank the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice, for their support. To support participation, this webinar includes closed captioning, American Sign Language, and in Spanish interpretation. Thank you for the captioners and interpreters, and we will take a brief moment to review logistical instructions. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Monica, and welcome everyone. My name is Sandra, and I am with my co-interpreter, David. We are the Spanish interpreters for today. We also, as was mentioned, have our co-interpreters, Logan and Mackenzie, who will be doing ASL interpretation today. We will give you some instructions to access the feature, both in English and Spanish, so that everyone can access the language of their preference. Buenos días a todos, mi nombre es Sandra, estoy con mi cointérprete David y somos los intérpretes al español el día de hoy. También hay lengua de señas estadounidense con Logan y Mackenzie y vamos a estar dando instrucciones para acceder a la interpretación en Zoom en inglés y en español para que todos puedan tener acceso en el idioma de su preferencia. So if you're joining from a computer, you will find the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. If it's not there, then go to the three-dotted menu that says More, then go to Language Interpretation, and then press English to be in the English channel. Make sure to not mute original audio or you won't be able to hear the main room. If you're joining from a phone call or a Chromebook computer, you won't have access to this feature. Si están uniéndose desde una computadora, pueden hacer, encontrar en la parte inferior de su pantalla un menú en forma de globo terráqueo que dice interpretación. Si no está ahí, está en un menú de 3 puntos que dice More o Más. Ahí encontrarán la opción Interpretación de idiomas, elijan español y presionen Listo. Si no desean escuchar el audio de la sala, pueden simplemente activar la función Silenciar audio original y con esto solo escucharán la voz de los intérpretes. If you're joining from a mobile device, you can tap lightly on your screen and then go to the three-dotted menu that says More. You might have to slide right to find it. Go to Interpretation, then press English and press Done. Once again, do not mute original audio or you won't be able to hear the main room. Si están uniéndose desde un dispositivo móvil, pueden hacer clic ligeramente en su pantalla, encontrarán el menú de 3 puntos que dice More o Más, igual o es posible que tengan que deslizar hacia la derecha para encontrarlo. Elijan español, presionen Listo o Done y con esto estará activada la función. If you have any trouble accessing this feature, please leave a message in the chat and we will be happy to assist. Si tienen algún problema accediendo a esta característica, déjenos un mensaje en el chat y nos dará gusto ayudarles. With this, we'll go back to Monica. Thank you very much.
Thank you. In the next slide, please, we have this webinar, again, is part of Futures Without Violence project called Building Collaborative Responses to Traffic Victims of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. And we would like to thank the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice for their support. And so in the next slide, we want to also welcome our presenters and thank them for their sharing their expertise. First, we have Caroline Ouya, Program Manager for the PIOS project at Futures Without Violence. She focuses on improving opportunities to quality education and employment for survivors of trafficking and violence. And Caroline has facilitated county-wide public health initiatives through her role within the Live Well San Diego Community Leadership Team, where she supported the County of San Diego in developing community action plans focused on behavioral health and economic mobility. And we also have Dr. Naveed Samani. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist practicing in San Diego. His interest is counseling, philosophy, and music, and are blended together with an interest in relational ethics, the politics of evolutionary love, and learning into complexity. He currently teaches at San Diego State University and is the head of clinical services at License to Freedom, a nonprofit that supports survivors who are experiencing domestic violence issues and human trafficking. So thank you so much and welcome. And so in the next slide, and they will add more about their experience in a minute. So briefly, we would like to review a few grounding group agreements to highlight that because domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking are prevalent, we assume that there are survivors among us. So take care of yourself first. It is okay to step away from the Zoom. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. And please keep in mind that the public chat is open and visible to everyone participating in this webinar session. So be careful not to share private or confidential information. The recording, slides, and handouts will be sent to you next week. And I will now turn over to Caroline, who will lead us in a brief moment of grounding. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Moni, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone in the room. We have about 306 people here, so it's a party. I am grateful to be here with you all, and we would love to start with an opportunity to ground together. One of my favorite quotes by Bell Hooks is that we rarely ever heal in isolation or by ourselves. We heal by being in community. And many of us in this room are advocates, are survivor leaders, are mental health clinicians. And often we don't take a moment to breathe until we're putting our head down on a pillow at the end of the day, moving from meeting to meeting or crisis to crisis. And so if you're looking on the screen, this visual shows you many of the scientific benefits of taking an intentional breath. And so we're going to take a minute to do that together and allow us to incorporate some of these healing aspects of intentional breathing into our life today. You don't have to participate, so if this is uncomfortable for you, please use this brief minute for something else. But if you're in need, I invite you to join us. So sit comfortably or stand comfortably wherever you are right now. And if there's a certain place in your body that has extra tension or extra stress right now, I want you to think that each of these breaths are going to go to that specific area. And I'm going to count to 3, and we're going to take a huge deep breath in together. We're going to hold it for 2 counts, and then we're going to breathe out like we're a fire-breathing dragon. Whatever we're holding on to, we're allowing it to release for just a few minutes. And we'll do that 3 times. So if you're ready, 1, 2, 3, breathe in. I'm doing the best I can with what I have. Hold that for 2 breaths and breathe out. And we'll do it 2 more times. 1, 2, 3. Breathe in. I am not alone in this work. I am not alone in this time. Hold that for 2 breaths and breathe out. And then we'll do it 1 more time. 1, 2, 3. Breathe in. I matter. What I do matters. My community matters. Hold that in for 2 counts and breathe out. Thank you so much for joining us in that mindful minute. Next slide. So our learning objectives for today. We are going to spend some time together identifying the impact of trauma on our on the cognitive, emotional, and physical well-being of survivors who are experiencing domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. We are going to take some time to recognize the common challenges of our current mental health systems that may impact the availability of resources for our community. And then we're going to talk about some innovative strategies and solutions that you all can incorporate into your programming and your collaborations in order to meet the mental health needs of survivors in your community. And so without further ado, let's get started. Next slide. So it's important to understand the prevalence of mental health and how it impacts survivors in our community. According to a research study and an article by Freedom Network, about 98% of trafficking survivors have some sort of symptoms or mental health challenges that they experience throughout their lifetime. And then we also know that 84.3% of survivors have used substances during their period of exploitation or during times when they are transitioning from that exploitation and trying to recover and heal. And so many survivors in our community are in need of mental health support, in need of support of addressing substance abuse issues, and feeling a part of the community that they are a part of, and also feeling that they are valued and that their experiences are being respected and reflected in their communities. Next slide. And when we think about mental health, it's not just about our thoughts. It impacts every single aspect of our life and our well-being, especially for survivors. When we look at the behavioral health issues and impacts of behavioral health issues that survivors may experience, there may be numbness or withdrawal, so it makes it difficult to engage with the services that you all are providing. We also know that some may be diagnosed with different mental health conditions, such as PTSD, depression, anxiety, or be struggling with whether their life matters and experiencing suicidal ideation. We also know in terms of their behavioral health that, some are struggling with sleep and getting the proper rest and comfort in their bodies that they need. Mental health can also show up physically. So some survivors may exhibit asthma or have chronic health challenges like diabetes or heart disease. Sometimes their mental health challenges may show up in their stomach and having stomach pains and intestinal issues. We know that some survivors experience chronic pain or have had traumatic brain injuries as a result of the violence and exploitation they've experienced. And even physically, they may be navigating unplanned pregnancies or sexually transmitted diseases as a result of the exploitation that they've experienced, if it's sexual. And we know that some of the survivors of human trafficking in our community experience labor trafficking also. And then when we look at cognitively, survivors have a hard time, some have a hard time with concentrating and making decisions. And so a lot of you play a role in supporting survivors through that process. Others are having flashbacks or are very hypervigilant, and so they're afraid and they are quick to defend themselves, believing that their environment is a threat, or you may be a threat because they're experiencing some level of insecurity in their time. And then we also know that mental health challenges and trauma impact our memory. And so some survivors may struggle to remember things about what they've experienced. And so it's important to just know that mental health challenges show up across all different parts of a survivor's life. And so we have to look at addressing it from a holistic perspective and incorporate strategies that take into account all of these different areas that mental health challenges can show up. Next slide. There's a really great video, and we'll make sure that it's in, we send it to you afterwards, that talks about the difference between being and operating in survival brain versus learning brain. And so the way that our brain works is that when we're in survival brain, we're focused a lot on threats, right? So what's going to come to get me right now? I feel unsafe. It makes it really hard for survivors to see into the future and plan for more than just this moment or a few days at a time. And often it's difficult for survivors to trust others. And so there's a lot of work that we must do to build healthy relationships with survivors in our community and build that trust. We know, though, with the right resources and the right, community resources and collaboration, that survivors can grow into being in a learning brain space where they're open and they're curious. They're able to see into the future. They're more comfortable with uncertainty, and there's a sense of calm. And so it's important to know these differences to see what strategies can you incorporate into your conversations and your experiences, to recognize when a survivor is in survival brain and what is needed to move them, safely to learning brain, where they can collaborate with you, to access the things that they need for their well-being, whether it's short-term or long-term. Next slide. It's very important for us to understand that we're very quick to pathologize and to name that someone has depression or someone has anxiety or whatever it may be. And those are real diagnoses, right? But for a lot of our survivors, their experiences are due to the circumstances in which they are living in. It's due to having struggles with accessing legal services or accessing housing. They're struggling with their confidence or trust because they are feeling unsafe and need some support creating a safety plan. We also know that some survivors struggle to access the economic security that they need or the financial resources that they need to feel secure. And so if you're going to address the mental health of survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking, we have to look at all of these different comprehensive approaches, to ensure that they're getting their basic needs met. Because if basic needs are met, it supports the survivor as a whole, and it allows them to be able to have the room to then engage with mental health clinicians, peer support groups, and other different strategies that we're going to talk more about today. And so we don't want to isolate addressing mental health to just finding a clinician. That's important, but we want to look at a more comprehensive approach to addressing mental health in our communities. Next slide. So before we get started with some of these tips and strategies, and before I pass it over to Naveed to give a bit more from his experience, we're going to do a poll to see how all of you are feeling in this room. There's about 358 people. So the question is, do you feel comfortable supporting survivors who are experiencing severe mental health challenges? So if you all can take a minute to answer to the best of your ability, what your comfort level is, and then we'll reflect these results back to you so that you can see where we are collectively. Okay, and I see some people putting it into the chat box, so I see a somewhat. A lot of yeses. So, we know that you all are experts also. You all know your community very well. And so we encourage you to put into the chat box any strategies, any resources, or any examples that you're comfortable sharing that we can all learn from. Okay, so it looks like we're getting to about critical mass, about 77%, 78% of you have responded. And so we're going to go ahead and end the poll and reflect the answers back to you. Okay, so as you can see, 45% of you feel that you feel comfortable supporting the mental health, survivors who are experiencing severe mental health challenges, but you're looking for more training and support on how to continue to do that well. Um, 30% of you say somewhat you manage. A lot of you in the room are very creative and innovative, and I know center survivors, and so you manage to the best of your ability, but you recognize how challenging it can be, especially if you don't have the right resources, supports, and relationships. So thank you all for sharing. And then for 4% of you who said, I'm unsure, that's okay. There are many skills that are associated with this process. And so there's room for all of us to continue growing and learning together. So thank you so much for sharing. And we'll stop sharing at the moment. Next slide. And so the question that I'll ask you all is, what additional resources or training or support would help you feel more confident? So if you all can take a few minutes and put that into the chat box, and let me see if I can engage with some of your great responses. Some of you have mentioned grounding, meditation, energy healing. Thank you for that. Some of you have mentioned never personalize the situation and meet a survivor where they're at. Some of you are putting clinical resources or modalities into the chat, such as EMDR or DBT, as things that can be supportive. And then it's concerning and frustrating that so many times mobile crisis is unsafe, I believe. I think that's what I'm seeing. Yes, you're right. So some of the resources that you all go through, connect to, may not always be as trauma informed as we would like it to be. Some of the resources and tools that are available in the community may not meet the holistic needs of those that you're serving. And so I can understand how there's a need for that. And then I see tools for keeping survivors on track once they're housed and safe. So yes, we have a lot of resources for navigating the initial crisis, but what does it look like to support a survivor long term and support their mental health beyond crisis? So thank you so much for mentioning that. So these are some great, examples that you all are putting into the chat box. And I'm going to turn it over now to Naveed to walk through some of the challenges that we experience and ways that we could address it.
Thanks, Caroline. And good morning and good afternoon to those of you that are on the West Coast or East Coast. It's very exciting to see folks from all over the country. To that end, I want to kind of acknowledge a couple important challenges faced by this presentation. One, that in any conversation facing a national audience, of course, there's an interest in generalized and specific at the same time suggestions. And I kind of want to situate a little bit about myself, that my work is really developed and situated here in San Diego. I work particularly with the Middle Eastern refugee communities. And my work has kind of supported survivors and perpetrators of violence and exploitation. So I've kind of been oriented in family systems as they're navigating these challenges. I'm also a marriage and family therapist, so my perspectives are skewed into the kind of the family therapy perspectives. So as you're listening to some of my learnings and my understandings, I invite you to kind of consider points of connection with my work, but also points of divergence, because both of those will kind of help perhaps bring you a little bit closer to the specificity of the work that you're doing. And again, as I share learnings that I've developed from my community in kind of general ways, some might apply to the communities that you serve, and some might not. May not. And I do think that it's a useful set of considerations in that. Well, I'll say this: for those of you who perhaps find yourself on the outside of any dominant community that you're working with, or perhaps you have access to a different language, you might know that it's readily available to notice what works and what doesn't work. So I'm an Iranian American man. I speak Farsi. I work prominently with Afghan and Arabic speaking communities, but I work a lot with Afghan and Iranian communities because of my access to Farsi. So a lot of my, the strategies and the approaches that I use have developed out of this linguistic context. And so while perhaps Spanish speakers or Black communities or other communities may find connection to these ideas, some of them may not apply. So just kind of an invitation to be in some reflection as we go through this. Next slide, please. So some ideas about how we might be reducing challenges to mental health. So again, I think I want to start off by saying that when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about psychology, we're centering a set of knowledges that has emerged out of the English language and within Western contexts. And when we're talking about something like mental health, we're talking about a linguistic frame. Mental health isn't something tangible that you can touch or grab or kind of like have a material access to. So therefore, when we start to talk about items like Caroline was mentioning, like depression or anxiety, to kind of start to understand where is the edges of depression, when does it start or when does it end, do I have it or do I have it not, we're necessarily engaging with linguistic understandings and cultural assumptions. So one of the things that I've noticed prominently in the conversations around mental health is this notion of reducing stigma, right? Kind of honoring or kind of acknowledging that perhaps there's other communities that aren't thinking about mental health or perhaps family therapy or some of the service we provide in the same way. So one of the things that I've kind of come to understand or experience when I'm working with survivors is that sometimes the assumption of reducing stigma is how do we bring them into understanding what mental health is and accessing our services. And rather, I kind of want to encourage us to maybe flip the script about how can we meet people where they're at culturally. So for example, some of the language, when I'm working with Arabic communities and explaining our services, sometimes the mental health stuff gets interpreted or translated into something closer to you're crazy and you need mental services or you need psychiatric help. And unless I have a very particular conversation with my interpreter, those understandings and the assumptions in those words kind of get carried forward much more quickly than I would hope. And so I've started to kind of describe my work more as like helping families sort through problems or helping an individual organize and sort through really painful memories. So I'm kind of more in a descriptive kind of process. So again, as I'm kind of describing this too, one idea I want to put forward that's relevant to my work is this idea of a parallel process. In some like more of the classical clinical settings, they might call this as being isomorphic. But the idea is that like the process that I'm going through with my client is a reflection or a model or some sort of like parallel relational process to perhaps the challenges they've faced. So for example, if you consider like a teacher in a classroom setting and how each teacher might have different strategies of engaging with their students, but those strategies ultimately kind of shape the culture of the classroom. And the culture of the classroom may or may not reflect the culture that they have at home. So when I myself in my body as a male identifying man who like presents male with a beard, and I start to engage in psychoeducational tactics where I'm like kind of talking, imagine I'm working with a female survivor and I'm telling them what to do and how to do it, and sometimes using tactics of fear that are available to me, like if you don't do this, XYZ will happen. I'm in so many ways recreating a patriarchal history and process within the counseling relationship. So I'm always really trying to be mindful of the parallel process that I'm in. So again, when we're reducing stigma, if we're kind of demanding people to meet us where we're at, in my opinion, we're kind of outside of an ethical stance of trying to kind of hear client stories and understand where they're at. So a big question I often ask is, how does your family, or how might you approach this in Iraq? How do people in Iran do this? How have you challenged, how might your family approach these challenges back home? And again, I'm not getting into a good or bad situation or like some kind of hierarchy of what's better or worse, but rather kind of trying to like understand and mine what's worked, what has been helpful. So this is my piece of, I guess I'm skipping now a little bit, but mining for healing practices. Another big thing is how can you minimize bureaucracy as much as possible and start with hospitality, right? Counseling and the work that we do ultimately as helpers is steeped in the relationship. And sometimes our interest in like a professional service starts to like pull away and strip us of the relational qualities and processes that actually make people trust us and feel connected to us and create the pathway for some sort of hopeful healing. So, you know, in the Middle Eastern communities that I work with, before you get down to business, we're having tea, we're having sweets, and I'm asking people about their family and how they're doing, and kind of like recreating and kind of emulating some of the cultural context that they might be familiar with relationally, rather than jumping right into an informed consent or kind of some of the more drier intakes or things that I'm doing. And like the communities that I work with from their home context, like bureaucracy actually isn't very familiar. So starting with bureaucracy can also be kind of scary, and depending on like the political context. And in this conversation, when I talk about politics, again, everyone, I'm not talking about like Democrats and Republicans or kind of like this more commonly used phrase of politics, but as much as like power, right? Because when we're talking about human trafficking, when we're talking about domestic violence, when we're talking about sexual assault, we are talking about power. So again, and also inviting reflection on looking at our power in a counseling relationship. And bureaucracy in the United States has a lot of power. It's the way that we pull funds. It's the ways that we start to gather data and build statistical understandings. And so, you know, clients can be pretty wary of bureaucracy. So an encouragement to wonder what is like the least amount of bureaucracy I can have, and how can I manage my relationship to bureaucracy that centers the relationship rather than the bureaucratic needs. And again, this is a very important challenge. Again, this is why I'm challenged by trying to be general here, because each of you might have different political structures and needs by your institution that you're working with that have different demands on your work. So it kind of is up to each person to negotiate and kind of be in some reflection about like what is a balance that I can strike. Linguistic support, which just want to say thank you to our interpreters here today, ASL, Spanish, all the folks. That sometimes, and you know, my interpreters here, you can correct me if I'm wrong, my experience in working with interpreters, because I've worked a lot with Arabic-speaking interpreters, is that sometimes interpretation is considered like a movement of language from one language to another one. It's kind of like a switch from English to Farsi or English to Spanish or whatever. And a couple important things to consider. One is that when we're going English to Spanish, English to Farsi, English to X, sometimes we're privileging English-dominated ideas and transferring them into another language with the assumption that they fit or work or will be received helpfully. And so rather than being positioned of what can my clients learn from me and my English-developed psychological understandings, I want to know, what can I learn from Farsi? What can I learn from Spanish? What can I learn from Swahili, right? Whatever language we're kind of referring to. The other piece that I want to kind of speak to this is that rather than considering the interpreter, the translator, as some sort of, kind of like a switch between languages, consider them as people who are cultural brokers as well. They are supporting in like bringing forward the affect, like the emotional qualities, the cultural understandings that might be useful in addition to just the switching of words. So for example, in the work that I do, my communities that I work with use a lot of metaphors, and they use a lot of stories, sometimes religious stories, sometimes cultural stories. And these stories have various idioms and learnings in them that are historical that I'm interested in. So kind of inviting the interpreter support with this process and also making them a third person in the conversation can be really useful. And I'll just kind of describe a very quick story into this effort to keep moving. A way where I was in a conversation with a Arabic-speaking man, and he had come in for anger management, and he shared a story about his involvement with a war that had taken place in this country. And as he was describing the ways that he was protecting his children from stories of this war, the interpreter also was reflecting on her own father, having participated in the same war and having never heard anything from him. So when she went home that night, we kind of like debriefed after, And when she went home that night, I kind of encouraged her. I was like, what if you asked your dad about that war? So she did, and she had this beautiful conversation with him. It was really kind of connecting and opening. And so when she came back, she shared about this amazing conversation she had with her father, and she learned so much from it. And I was like, do you mind would you be open to sharing that with the client? And so when the session started, she shared it with the client, and I just kind of sat back and let the conversation happen. And the connection and the work that happened in there was way more powerful and beautiful than anything I could have ever supported. In that she linked the beauty and connection that she had with her father, and he was making kind of interpretations about how he might be open and vulnerable with his family, and kind of bring them into this history that has been having so much effect on him. And then embracing, of course, that within all cultures and communities, there are broad kind of scripts that folks might follow, but also each person, each family has a different relationship to these scripts, which is true here in the United States, right? We talk about the United States as this big kind of unified thing, but each community, each area, each region, even within each city, there's very specific idiosyncrasies and nuances that are rich and beautiful and worth wondering about. Next slide, please. And I'll add this too, because I'm looking at something in the chat that dialects matter. So when we're talking about for interpretation, when you're working, for example, with an Arabic speaker who's from Iraq, to not assume that that's the same dialect as Arabic speakers from Lebanon, for example, or from Egypt, and that the dialect really matters. Okay, so continuing on and reducing challenges to mental health. So again, this is another invitation for some reflexivity around your own role and power, is to be really transparent about your role and what your work is and what you're trying to do. All of us occupy different lanes of the service field, and each corridor of the service field has a different perspective on how healing looks and what the pathway is, right? So in my world, I work a lot with judges and lawyers and law enforcement and social workers, and each of us has a different perspective on what the pathway is forward. And I don't think any of us have the full picture to any degree. So kind of being in community with our service provider colleagues is really important, but also establishing for our clients, especially clients who are coming from other countries and other contexts, that doesn't have the professionalized specificity that we have here in the United States. So I want to kind of clarify this and speak to this more articulately, that it is a bit of a unique system that we have in the United States to be sent to different providers who are kind of doing the same thing. And think about for yourself, if you can name the difference between a psychologist, a social worker, an MFT, an LPCC, these are all very similar fields, but also doing different stuff at the end of the day. And clients don't really understand or know or need to kind of know about that. So being really transparent, how am I positioned in the service provider field? What is my power and my influence that I can have on your life? Is a really important step in kind of supporting the relationship. I kind of mentioned that we want to continually be identifying healing practices in the context of our clients' customs and traditions, and pull those into our service rather than trying to put our service model onto clients. And again, informed consent should happen throughout. As clients start to share stories or kind of move towards a particular direction or story, and you feel that your kind of ticker going off, that you might have to do something about your relationship to confidentiality, for example, that we're kind of reminding clients what our role is and how we might have to respond if something comes up. And I think that gives clients agency in making decisions for their service. Next slide, please. And again, I think one of the challenges of the work that we do, in that it is relational, is that if you think about ways that we measure the world around us. So for example, if you want to measure the temperature, you use a thermometer. If you want to kind of get a sense of your the tire pressure, use one of those little pressure gauge things, right? There's all these different ways that we're measuring stuff around us. In our work as helpers, generally speaking, we are kind of measuring our work in the context of the relationship with the client we have. So you become the measuring instrument, right? So when you're engaging with someone and things feel kind of tight, and there's a certain type of relational response and engagement that you're getting, and for example, someone comes into the office and they're really upset and they're hyper focused on one item and they keep going at this one item, I'm getting a relational experience that's for me very frustrating perhaps, or agitating or activating, but also I'm learning some stuff about some relational styles. I'm also learning what is important to this person. And so this is where I think that our work becomes really important in being very self-reflexive, so that we can kind of sit in those situations and be able to not be so activated that we can't consider useful next steps and useful information that's coming to us. And we also want to be highlighting the agency of clients. I think sometimes the challenge of some of the broad descriptions of human trafficking or domestic violence, for example, kind of renders people into victim characters where they're just kind of like subjected to the world around them and power. But also what we want to do is kind of be listening carefully to the story they're sharing, who their identity or character becomes as they're sharing the story, and keeping a keen ear out for ways that they're in resistance. Because kind of like one of the assumptions that I hold is that like oppression and resistance are two sides of the same coin when we're talking about power, and that people don't just typically take it. And often when people are kind of coming out of traumatic experiences or events, the story tends to render themselves as useless and unhelpful, and I wasn't able to do it. But in my experience, I've yet to meet someone who fully just took it. They were often people are in acts of resistance without even knowing it or without it being storied in. So as you can imagine, all this stuff does require folks to kind of sit around with perhaps their teams and think about what is working, what's not working, how might our clients respond to these policies or these practices. And that my suggestion for sites is to really consider developing practices together as a team in reflection about how it's impacting themselves and their clients, and be open to a context where you might be evaluating situations case by case rather than by policy. And the big challenge here is time and money. Kind of creates some restrictions and around what is possible for us. Next slide, please. So rather than kind of like overly simplistic descriptions of people's lives, I'm really kind of encouraging us leaning into complexity. Moving towards more flexible, person-centered approaches rather than one-size-fits-all, because again, what I'm doing here in San Diego with Middle Eastern communities may not be the same as what someone in Florida might be doing with Spanish-speaking communities, for example. And even if we keep the language the same, San Diego Spanish-speaking communities and Florida Spanish-speaking communities have their own histories and rich experiences that are worth considering the specificity of. And then we want to be really mindful, kind of again, like how our stakeholders kind of arriving at their conclusions, and stakeholders being all the different services that each of us provide. How do MFTs think about what's useful, and how might they be kind of guiding their clients based on their social historical context? So for example, in my work, part of healing is kind of addressing relationships and the family relationships that people are in, and like Caroline so nicely spoke to, like also being really careful of diagnostic, kind of entering in with some diagnostic approaches, and rather considering more fully and wholly what is the circumstances and the environmental context that might shape someone into responding in the ways that they are, or kind of shaping their experiences in these particular ways. Next slide, please. So again, I want to like really encourage this thing about expanding complexities, because in my experience, the domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking worlds have these really nice graphs and models that are useful. I'm not talking against them, but things like the power control wheel, or like various other graphs and images that help us as providers conceptualize generally a set of experiences, but need to be really careful to not take those and kind of wait for client stories and how to slot them into those graphs and models, and rather how to develop a model based on the story you're hearing and how it may or may not match what you know. So again, it requires a position of not knowing and a position of curiosity, and that one of your big tools is asking questions and learning more about how people are understanding their life and what happens. And again, we're not in hierarchies of good or bad or what's better or worse, because again, those models and graphs may actually provide some really important information that might feel liberating for folks who feel alone or isolated in an experience. But I guess I'm encouraging that we don't start there. We learn from our clients first. And like I was saying about this parallel process, how might you be reinforcing a system of control or creating space for survivor autonomy? And sometimes our systems of control are shaped by the institutions we work in, by like policies or demands that are placed on us by various stakeholders in our work. And one of the things that I truly believe is that burnout does not come from clients. It comes from systems and institutions that don't respond or might not be as useful as we're hoping that they might be. And my experience in this field for almost 2 decades is the burnout comes from kind of continually coming up against these systemic walls. Next slide, please. So I use the model and the theory that I use is called narrative therapy, which focuses on storytelling and how a particular identity is developed and emerges within a story, and privileges the process versus the outcome. And what I mean by that is a lot of times, because of the funding, how funding is shaped, how billing kind of positions us, we're often looking for these outcomes or these kind of goals that are kind of like material and achievable, which are good and important. But I think almost all research indicates that the most healing part of this work is the relationship and not even the theory or the outcomes. It's that someone feels listened to, understood, and supported through a very dynamic experiences, right? Because human trafficking, stories of survival and exploitation are extremely dynamic and relational, and sometimes require some slowness. And like I mentioned, create the space and hospitality that reflects the communities you serve. In my world, it's tea, it's fruit, it's slow, it's casual. Sometimes we're kind of sitting on the floor. Our office has a lot of the design and rugs and kind of aesthetics of their cultural context in an effort to honor their traditions, their customs, and their practices around healing. Because in our communities here in San Diego, the Middle Eastern ones, when you are suffering and hurt, you might go to your grandma's house, or you might go to your aunt's house, and they often start with some tea and some soup, perhaps. And so I want to like capture that energy rather than trying to recreate some professional process that's foreign and this just doesn't feel as cozy, I suppose. Next slide, please. I believe that counseling can be very helpful. I don't think it's the only answer, and I don't think everyone benefits from counseling for a number of reasons. One, it really matters. Again, the relationship between the counselor and the client is super important, and it just is the case that not everyone is this right match. I have a lot of experience in this field, a lot of research. I have a lot of titles, but that doesn't mean that I am equipped to work with everyone. Not everyone wants to work with me, especially like the identities that I inhabit, as like a male. Like I have a lot of clients who are survivors who don't want to work with a male therapist, and that makes a lot of sense. And that just needs to be honored, I suppose. When we're thinking about supporting survivors, understanding healthy relationships versus exploitative dynamics, again, like if you can imagine me working with a female survivor, the way that I behave with them is a sort of a model, hopefully, of a healthy relationship. And so it creates the groundwork for how to start talking about healthy relationships. And often I'm using my clients' stories and what's important to them and their values as a way to kind of develop what a healthy relationship might be, rather than going through a list of green flags and red flags, if that makes sense. Not to say that isn't helpful, and it can be very useful in like kind of starting a conversation, but my ears are really tuned into what does this person value and find important, because I hold the assumption that our motivation in life to take any action is driven by things that are important to us, and if we don't care, we probably won't engage. Yeah, and I want to check in, Caroline, if there's anything that you wanted to add to this slide before I go to the next one. No pressure if not. Okay, we'll keep going then. But if you want to come back, Caroline, please do. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. And as you go to the next slide, I'm going to accentuate this again. We're kind of honoring relationships and not transactional kind of context where we're just kind of exchanging services. When we're talking about building a referral community, most research indicates that 50% of clients kind of drop off in a referral process, and that's kind of like the more generous number. And so making sure that you're kind of supporting clients and making contact with those referrals, making sure those referrals actually still exist, as like the provider field shifts pretty regularly, and kind of explaining to them what they might anticipate, rather than kind of giving people a checklist of referrals is really important. Engaging community members as they can serve critical stakeholders for safety and peace. And one of the things that we do is we work a lot with fairly religious communities. So for example, we work with Chaldean Iraqi communities, which are Christian Iraqis that came in the late 90s, early 2000s to the United States. And in those communities, like there was a number of Chaldean churches in the area that we're kind of in conversation with the pastors and the priests about. And we kind of like see which ones, we do a little bit of vetting, like my own personal vetting to see who might kind of be the most safe or useful. And those people are drawn in because I cannot take on the full scope of a conversation or someone's experience. When people start talking about religious understandings, that's outside my scope. I won't be able to refer to the Bible or the Quran in any useful way. And so that's when I bring in folks to support me. I mentioned the thing about the interpreters. And again, a big encouragement to everyone to, with your teams, name your community ethics. Like what does our agency stand for? And then how do we kind of assess for these qualities in the referrals we provide? And how do we also like stand for these things in the work we do? This, I believe, should be a bi-weekly or monthly conversation, and through which all of our kind of supervision or kind of case consultations are kind of filtered through, is what are we trying to do and what do we stand for? Next slide, please. Yeah, and I think to, again, honor this piece here, and I'm interested in your opinions here as well, Caroline, is like, we're working with people who are coming from tight, tense contexts where relationships have been harmful, exploitative, and violent, to name a couple possibilities. And so not assuming that people are going to land into our work and our lives with those usefully or with qualities of connection and all the ways that we hope people engage with us. So how do you kind of create context that honor the development towards some relational ethics and some ways of engaging with others that isn't like the survival brain that Caroline was referring to, but engaging with people and us in slow, kind of responsive and careful ways. And I'm going to pause here, Caroline, to check in with you.
Naveed, yes, there is a lot of research that shows the benefits of peer support groups and peer mentorship for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And as Naveed has painted, the picture really well from his experience, the importance of surrounding a survivor with as many trusting and healthy relationships as possible. And so if you're currently running a program and you don't have a connection to a peer support group or a peer mentorship program, or if you have the ability to create one, they can be really helpful. And we've seen peer support groups and mentorship groups run in a variety of different ways. Some of them are topic specific, where throughout that mentorship group, they're focusing on economic empowerment or security, or they're focusing focusing on building boundaries, or they're focusing on navigating a particular challenge, whether it's finances. And so you get to, by learning from the survivors in your community, like Naveed has mentioned, you can identify how to run a peer support group or a peer mentorship group that will be beneficial for your community. But there is a lot of research that shows the benefits of that. Um, and we also know that there are, group and individual therapy components that are out there that are related to mental health. And we'll talk a little bit about that, collaborating with some of those organizations like NAMI, or Mental Health America that hosts peer groups. And so the question becomes, what does it look like to bring those partners into your programming, to help support with that gap that you all may have, and building a relationship with them, and the resources they have in navigating different mental health challenges, to be able to support you all in creating those groups for the survivors in your community. And then, as Naveed has mentioned, survivors are operating within a context of their own family and their own community. And so you want to identify ways to bring those conversations into the case management practices that you all are doing, into the groups and individual therapies that you all are offering. And you can do this creatively, which is helpful to go to the next slide, to lift up some examples of what this has looked like in some other organizations. So next slide. So, the first that we'll say, and these are examples of some, peer support groups that have focused around somatic healing, which means healing practices that support our body. So if you remember in the beginning of our conversation, we talked about how mental health can show up physically, and how mental health can show up and impact, our navigation between survival brain and learning brain. And so we're seeing organizations across the nation incorporate sensory tools and different sensory healing practices into the work that they're doing to help address mental health challenges. So this looks like offering aromatherapy and soothing scents, and I think some of you had put this in the chat box of, incorporating yoga and meditation so that that can help the person sort of center themselves. There's also ways to help survivors get in touch with, their five senses. That's the best way to describe that. Does the mental health practices and resources that you're offering incorporate the five senses that survivors, that all of us have? And what can it look like for you all to incorporate that a bit better into the programming that you offer, into the conversations and relationships that you're building? So, we've seen some offices have stress balls. They have, different areas where people can color, where they can play with different toys. And those can be very helpful to support a survivor in staying in their body long enough to work with you, to connect to additional resources that they may need. And so, for example, there's a wonderful program called You Are More Than that we're connected with, and they have a pottery support group. And so they use pottery as a way to address that sensory body piece. And then they also have dynamic conversations that they're having around clay therapy. And it's connecting that I am safe in my body and I'm building these great relationships. There's another example from Polaris, where organizations have incorporated art therapy. Naveed over at License to Freedom, I know that they have music therapy, and that, some people come in and they do dance therapy. And there's a lot of people in your community that are willing to come in and volunteer their time to offer this to your community. So we encourage you to build relationships with them and see if they can come, even if it's one day a month, right? Those are different practices that have been helpful. When I was working in direct service, we brought in self-defense classes. And so survivors were able to take these self-defense classes, and we were able to weave in conversations throughout those self-defense classes that allowed a survivor to become equipped with not just physically, but emotionally. And I'm seeing in the chat box that and I'm not sure, I think it's Debbie, you say you all bring in therapy dogs. So this is just examples of how to expand beyond, we don't have enough clinicians to refer to. And then that's where the conversation ends. So what we're encouraging you all to do is to get creative and build relationships with some of these other practitioners, right? And see if they can come in, and many of them are willing to volunteer their time to provide these services. And so I saw a choir, some of you have choirs that you've offered, guided writing, drawing, reflecting. So these are just examples that we encourage you all to take a look at and figure out how could you incorporate that a bit more into the programming that you're offering. So thank you so much, Diane. Self-defense, yes, we found that to be very beneficial in the community that we were a part of, for survivors who got to learn that they already know, many of them, they're innovative, they have power. And sometimes it's about reminding them that this power is within them, and these resources and conversations and creativity allow those aspects of themselves to come out. And then it challenges what, as Naveed had said, that victim mentality, right? That we often, the systems and sometimes us as we're working with survivors, can put onto the communities that we're serving. So we thank you so much for highlighting those different practices. Next slide. So we have about 15 minutes, so we're going to move a little bit faster through these next pieces. And it's going to just highlight some additional areas that you can collaborate with. I think a few of you in the chat talked about the importance of psychoeducation, and allowing room for survivors to learn about their emotions and learn about their behaviors and gain tools that can help them cope and address that. And so it's important to incorporate that into your conversations and connect with individuals who can bring that understanding into your community. So we did one together this morning, grounding techniques such as breathing together, using our five senses to allow us to return to our bodies and be present. We have talked about different relaxation activities. Survivors are human like you and I. Many of us who are in this field, may identify with survivors ourselves, like want to have fun, want to engage in new experiences, and those things can be so healing. And so if there are ways that you can incorporate that into your programming, it supports the mental health of survivors. It allows them for just a few minutes, within a day or within a month, to step away from the heaviness of the exploitation that they've experienced or that they are experiencing, and find joy, find peace, and reconnect with their identity. That is what mental health is, strengthening the mental health of survivors. That's what it is at its core. And so, controlled breathing techniques, and there's many different trainings out there. There's a model called the community resiliency model that trains you on some of these coping skills that you can use in the moment to help your community ground. And so we encourage you to take a look at that. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what are some of those local mental health resources that you all can tap into. And there's some great feedback happening in the chat box. So I thank you so much for that. I think, Kate, you just put in, there's different trauma releasing exercises by allowing the body to tremor. Yes. So if you look at, I used to watch National Geographic all the time. And if you look at animals who have just escaped from almost animals being eaten by a lion, when they are done, you see that their body automatically shakes, right? And that's them getting rid of some of those high stress experiences that are going on in their body. So these are tangible tools that connect to our nervous system that you all can learn and be able to offer to your community. And so we just seen a recommendation in the chat box about using YouTube videos that are free that you can do together to be able to support with that. So thank you so much for lifting that up. Next slide. We are going to skip this because some of you are already giving some great, feedback in the chat. So if we can go to the next slide. So your local public health system, while it is not perfect, can be a resource and a partner in this work. So for example, many of your, public health communities have suicide prevention councils, and these suicide prevention councils go out into the community to train on QPR and ASSIST, which are evidence-based models for addressing suicide ideation. If somebody is feeling suicidal, what they can do to address that. You can partner with these suicide prevention councils to bring that training to yourself and to your staff, as well as the survivors in your community. And it helps to address that psychoeducation piece and helps that individual feel empowered and know where to start if that experience is happening. The same goes for some of these other local public health offices like Mental Health America. I believe someone from the chat box, and I'm sorry I can't see your names, mentioned mental health first aid. Mental health first aid is offered for free for different populations across the nation. So what does it look like to not only train your staff in that, but offer those opportunities to the survivors in your community as a way for them to learn more about mental health and some of the ways that they can navigate it and some of the resources and tools that are available. So we encourage you to look up some of those trainings and see if they can come in-house and provide them for the survivors that you're working with. The same goes for NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They host groups, they host peer groups, they host education communities where you can learn about bipolar disorder and some of these disorders. And while we want to step away from that framing, as Naveed had said, to label, it's important for us to learn, right? And so we encourage you as providers to take those classes so that you feel confident about the strategies that you can use that's associated with specific diagnoses. And then those same trainings can be offered to the survivors so that they are now advocates for themselves and others in their community around the different mental health challenges experienced. And then the last that we'll lift up is that your local community health centers often have, some programming that they can offer related to behavioral health. And for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and even human trafficking, they sometimes have exceptions on enrollment for insurance based on experiencing that exploitation. So we encourage you to connect with those health centers, and if you need some resources to learn a little bit more about that enrollment process, we can send that over to you. But these are your partners, and so it's not about fitting into necessarily what they are providing. It's about connecting with them and figuring out how can they bring some of those pieces into your community. And then you all add the community specific contributions, right? As Naveed has mentioned, some of the customs and traditions to make sure what's being provided in those spaces align with the communities that you're serving. Next slide. And in the chat box, the link that's been provided has a list of all of these resources. And I believe there's a national finders where you can go in and find the ones closest to you. And then these are some additional resources. And what we want to lift up that's in the guide that we've provided is that there are community specific therapy directories. So for example, therapy for Latinx community, inclusive therapists. There's therapy for Black girls. I mean, the list goes on in terms of these databases that have therapists who align with that community. So we've listed those databases into the resource list that you all are going to get. And we encourage you to connect with that resource list if you're looking for community specific therapists who understand some of the culture, the nuances and cultures that are in your community. And for some of these directories, they do offer sliding scale, low cost therapy services. So if you look at Open Path Collective is one of them that has low cost therapy services for the community. So we've provided all of that in the resource list for you all to go to if you're looking for additional resources of how you can connect survivors to these therapists. And then You Are More Than, who offers training and technical assistance for survivors of trafficking. They train mental health. They train you all on supporting the mental health of human trafficking survivors. So we encourage you to connect with them and support. And so in terms of collaboration tips, as we narrow down with our 4 minutes, Naveed and I are mentioning that the most important thing about mental health is building relationships and community. And I think that we all have our own expertise on how we can do that. And so sometimes when we think of the mental health of someone, we become afraid because we're not connected to a clinician. But we're encouraging you all to get creative on how you can offer these opportunities to build relationships and build community in your area. And you want to make sure that you do some vetting, right? Maybe you all have to do some education to these referral systems to make sure that they do not do harm and that they are safe for your community. And so that's a tip to keep in mind. And then you can train these clinicians on some of the nuances of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking so that they can dig a little deeper in that if that's not their expertise. And so these are some collaboration tips that we offer up. Use your community. You may know someone that offers dance classes. Call them. See if they're willing to come in, right? Someone who is an artist. Hey, do you want to offer an art class? This is a way to start as you figure out ways to connect to these clinicians and these databases that we've mentioned. Next slide. Next slide. So one of the questions that came up, and thank you so much, Diana, is about how do we support survivors? How do we support staff who are going through their own struggles and trying to support a survivor in their community? And I feel like this is a question that comes up over and over again, especially during times like this. And so we encourage you all to check out the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit that has been created by the Office of Victims of Crimes. There's some great resources and tools that you can incorporate into your services. And then some of those dance classes, art classes, those opportunities to breathe, they can be offered to the staff as well. It's about creating room for staff to understand that they're human first before helper. Right? And so we encourage you all to look at this Vicarious Trauma Toolkit, where there's a lot of great tips and resources that can be helpful in supporting the needs of staff in your community. And I feel like this can be a whole entire topic on its own. So maybe we have to come back and focus primarily on navigating this issue, but that's the most important thing. And so we only have 1 minute left. We have so many resources that we've put in our resource guide that you all can tap into. And we just want to take a minute to thank you all for being here. I know, it can feel theoretical, some of the things that we're saying, but what we want you to walk away with is it's okay to be creative. Okay, it's okay to be creative when you're trying to address the mental health needs of survivors in your community. What does it look like to incorporate joy? What does it look like to incorporate rest? And so that's the question we want you to walk away with as you are developing these relationships and building these networks. Thank you so much for your time today.
Can you move to the last slide, please? So everyone can see the contact information. Thank you everyone for participating, and thank you to Navid and Caroline for a great presentation, and also for the interpreters. And have a great afternoon, everyone. And please reach out with any questions for additional resources, training opportunities. And we do have another webinar on Thursday. If you're signed up, we'll see you on Thursday on victims' rights. And our email address is on the screen, learning@futureswithoutviolence.org. Please reach out to us with any questions. And if you need a certificate of participation, please also include that in the evaluation form. Please provide your feedback, any questions in the evaluation form, we will follow up with you. The link is not working for the evaluation. Okay, we will send you the link over email if that link is not working. Apologies, and I will